There exists a strange phenomenon in every room where power gathers. The person who speaks least often controls most. The one who smiles while others argue holds the invisible strings that move the entire performance. This is not coincidence or accident, but the deliberate construction of an architecture that most never learn to see, let alone build for themselves. Power does not announce itself with fanfare and proclamation. It settles into a room like smoke, filling the spaces between words, occupying the silences that make others uncomfortable. The loudest voice in any gathering is rarely the one that matters most. Volume is the refuge of those who mistake noise for influence, who believe that filling the air with their presence will somehow make them significant. But significance is not seized through declaration. It is recognized in the spaces where others expect you to speak, and you choose not to. Consider how desperately most people rush to fill silence. They cannot bear the weight of unspoken moments. When conversation pauses, they leap to bridge the gap with nervous laughter, with explanations no one requested, with confessions that serve as currency for acceptance. They reveal themselves not through choice, but through compulsion, unable to resist the gravitational pull of empty air. And in their rush to fill that void, they show every card in their hand while learning nothing about the cards held by others. The person who can sit comfortably in silence becomes a mirror in which others see their own discomfort reflected. When you refuse to speak simply because quiet has fallen, when you deny others the reassurance of your immediate reaction, something fascinating occurs. They begin to project onto you their own fears, their own assumptions, their own weaknesses. They tell themselves stories about what your silence means, and these stories reveal far more about them than any question you might have asked. This is the first architecture of invisible power. Your silence becomes a canvas on which others paint their anxieties. They wonder if you are angry, if you are judging them, if you are planning something they cannot see. The less you give them to work with, the more their imagination fills the gaps. And imagination, when fueled by uncertainty, is always more powerful than any truth you could speak. But silence alone is not enough. It must be paired with something equally unsettling. The human mind craves patterns. It seeks to categorize, to predict, to file away behaviors into neat boxes that can be understood and therefore controlled. When you behave predictably, when your responses follow expected patterns, you become a known quantity. And known quantities are manageable. They can be manipulated through simple cause and effect. Press this button, get this reaction. Say these words, receive this response. The person who refuses to be predictable breaks this fundamental contract of social interaction. They do not react when provoked. They do not defend when accused. They do not explain when misunderstood. This is not rudeness or cruelty. It is the deliberate choice to remain unknowable, to deny others the map they desperately want to draw of your internal landscape. Think about how much energy people spend trying to figure out what others want from them. They study reactions, memorize triggers, catalog preferences. They become students of manipulation without realizing they are enrolled in the course. They learn which compliments make you soften, which criticisms make you defensive, which silences make you confess. They build a manual for managing you, page by page, interaction by interaction. But when you refuse to be consistent in your reactions, when you respond to the same stimulus differently each time, their manual becomes useless. They cannot predict whether their usual tactics will work. They cannot rely on their standard manipulations. They are forced to approach you with genuine uncertainty, with actual respect for the unknown quantity you represent. This unpredictability must be cultivated carefully. It is not chaos or random emotional swings. It is the deliberate choice to respond based on your own internal compass rather than external expectations. Sometimes you engage fully in conversation. Sometimes you remain silent. Sometimes you offer help. Sometimes you decline without explanation. The key is that your choices stem from your own sovereignty, not from prescribed social scripts. Now we arrive at a deeper truth about emotional mastery. Most people are puppets to their own feelings. Someone insults them, and they must defend. Someone compliments them, and they must reciprocate. Someone guilts them, and they must appease. They live their entire lives at the mercy of emotional triggers they have never taken time to understand, much less disarm. The person who has mapped their own emotional landscape, who knows exactly which words pierce their armor and why, possesses a form of power that cannot be taken away. They recognize when someone is attempting to pull their strings. They see the manipulation coming like a slow pitch across home plate, and they choose whether to swing or let it pass by. This is not about becoming emotionless or dead inside. Emotions are data, valuable information about your internal state and external environment. The key is to experience them without being ruled by them, to feel anger without immediately expressing it, to sense guilt without automatically yielding to it, to receive praise without becoming dependent on it. When you master this separation between feeling and action, you become genuinely dangerous to those who rely on emotional manipulation. They push your buttons and nothing happens. They pull your triggers and you do not fire. They attempt to guilt you into compliance, and you simply observe the attempt without participating in it. This breaks their entire model of how human interaction works. But here we must address a critical distinction. There is a vast difference between vulnerability and exposure. Most people confuse the two, believing that honesty means revealing everything, that authenticity requires complete transparency. They spill their secrets like water from a broken dam, flooding everyone around them with more information than anyone asked for or wanted. This is not vulnerability. This is bleeding in public. True vulnerability is selective, strategic, purposeful. It is the choice to reveal specific aspects of yourself to specific people who have earned the right to see them. It is not the compulsive confession of every thought and feeling to anyone who will listen. Consider how often people mistake oversharing for connection. They trauma dump on strangers. They confess their deepest fears to people who have shown no capacity to hold such information responsibly. They hand out intimate knowledge of themselves like flyers on a street corner, then wonder why they feel so exposed, so raw, so used. The person who practices selective vulnerability understands that not everyone deserves access to their inner world. They share their struggles with those who have proven themselves trustworthy. They reveal their fears to those who have demonstrated they will not weaponize them. They offer their dreams to those who have shown they will protect them rather than mock them. This selective sharing creates a hierarchy of intimacy that actually means something. When you share everything with everyone, your revelations lose their value. But when you carefully choose what to reveal and to whom, your vulnerability becomes a gift rather than a burden. It becomes something people earn rather than something they endure. Now we must confront one of the most powerful control mechanisms in human society. Guilt is the invisible leash by which most people are led through their entire lives. They do things they do not want to do because they feel guilty saying no. They apologize for boundaries they have every right to set. They sacrifice their own needs on the altar of avoiding the discomfort of letting others down. But guilt is not some noble emotion that keeps society functioning. It is a tool of control, weaponized by those who understand how to wield it. The manipulator does not need to threaten or coerce. They only need to sigh at the right moment, to look disappointed in just the right way, to mention how much they were counting on you. And like a well-trained animal, you respond to these cues with immediate compliance. The truly free person has learned to sit with guilt without being moved by it. They understand that feeling guilty and being guilty are not the same thing. They recognize that the discomfort of disappointing others is not an emergency that requires immediate action. They can hold space for someone else's disappointment without rushing to fix it. This is perhaps the most difficult skill to develop because guilt is installed in us from childhood. We are taught that good people do not let others down. Good people say yes when asked. Good people sacrifice themselves for the comfort of others. These lessons run so deep that questioning them feels like questioning our fundamental morality. But consider what this programming actually creates. It produces adults who cannot say no without elaborate justification. It generates people who apologize for having needs. It manufactures individuals who are so concerned with being seen as good that they never develop the strength to be themselves. The person who has broken free from guilt as a control mechanism does not become cruel or heartless. They simply become sovereign. They make choices based on their own values and boundaries rather than on the emotional manipulation of others. They can say no without needing to justify it. They can disappoint others without seeing it as a moral failure. This freedom from guilt creates a fascinating dynamic. Those who have always controlled you through guilt suddenly find their primary weapon has been disarmed. They escalate their attempts, becoming more dramatic in their disappointment, more theatrical in their sighing, more elaborate in their attempts to make you feel bad for protecting your own energy. And this is where the true test begins. Can you sit in their disappointment without yielding? Can you watch them paint you as the villain without rushing to correct the narrative? Can you allow them to be upset with your boundaries without abandoning them? The person who can do this discovers something remarkable. The discomfort is temporary. The disappointment passes. The attempts at guilt-tripping eventually cease when they prove ineffective. And what remains is a new dynamic, one where your boundaries are respected, not because people like them, but because they have learned they cannot move them. This creates a different kind of relationship with the world around you. You stop being someone things happen to and become someone who happens to things. You stop being reactive and become deliberate. You stop being manageable and become sovereign. The human mind harbors a peculiar weakness that most never recognize, much less overcome. It will do almost anything to avoid the discomfort of confrontation. This aversion runs deeper than mere preference for peace. It operates at a primal level, making people agree to things that harm them simply because refusal feels more uncomfortable than compliance. Watch how this plays out in everyday interactions. Someone makes an unreasonable request, and instead of simply declining, the person being asked begins an elaborate dance of justification. They explain why they cannot help, offer alternatives they do not want to provide, apologize for circumstances beyond their control. All of this performance serves one purpose: to avoid the raw discomfort of simply saying no and letting it stand. The manipulator understands this weakness intimately. They know that most people will choose the path of least resistance, and they deliberately make resistance feel like the harder choice. They do not need to force or threaten. They only need to create an atmosphere where refusal feels ruder, crueler, more uncomfortable than surrender. This is accomplished through subtle means: a slight change in tone when their request is questioned, a pause that stretches just long enough to become uncomfortable, a look of surprise that suggests your boundary is unexpected, unreasonable, perhaps even offensive. These small theatrics are usually enough to make the average person crumble, to make them doubt their right to refuse, to make them choose compliance over the discomfort of holding their ground. The person who wishes to be free must develop a different relationship with discomfort. They must learn to see it not as an emergency to be resolved, but as weather to be endured. When someone becomes upset at your boundary, that discomfort belongs to them, not to you. Your job is not to manage their emotional state. Your job is to maintain your own sovereignty. But there is another behavior that signals weakness even more clearly than the inability to refuse. It is the compulsive need to apologize before anyone has even suggested wrongdoing. Listen to how people speak when they assert even the mildest boundary. They begin with apology, as if their very existence requires forgiveness. These preemptive apologies are not politeness. They are surrenders offered before the battle has begun. They tell everyone within hearing that you do not believe you have the right to your own boundaries. that you feel guilty for having needs, that you see your own self-protection as an offense requiring absolution. The person who apologizes for their boundaries undermines them in the very act of setting them. They communicate that these limits are negotiable, that with enough pressure they will yield, that they themselves do not fully believe in what they are saying. This is why manipulators push hardest against those who apologize most. They recognize the apology as a white flag, a signal that victory is already theirs if they simply persist. Consider the difference between these two responses. The first person says they cannot attend an event with elaborate apologies, explanations of their schedule, promises to make it up somehow. The second person simply says they will not be there. Which one do you think faces more pressure to change their mind? Which one has their decision questioned and challenged? Which one ends up exhausted from defending a simple choice? The apologetic person has entered into a negotiation they did not intend to start. By justifying their decision, they have implied that with the right justification, the decision could be changed. By apologizing, they have suggested they are doing something wrong that requires forgiveness. By explaining, they have opened the door to counter-arguments. The person who states their boundary without decoration closes all these doors. They offer no opening for negotiation, no weak points to exploit, no guilt to leverage. They simply present reality as it is, can allow others to adjust to it or not as they choose. But now we must examine one of the most seductive traps of all. Praise, when wielded correctly, is more powerful than any criticism. It creates a dependency that runs deeper than fear, a hunger that can never quite be satisfied. The person who becomes addicted to praise will do anything to keep receiving it, including betraying their own values and boundaries. Watch how this mechanism operates. Someone compliments your generosity, and suddenly you find yourself being more generous than you can afford. They praise your availability, and you become available even when you need rest. They celebrate your selflessness, and you sacrifice yourself until there is nothing left to give. This is not genuine appreciation. This is transactional flattery, designed to purchase your continued service. The manipulator has learned that praise is cheaper than payment, that compliments cost nothing but can buy everything. They study what makes you glow with pride, and then deploy that knowledge strategically to keep you performing for their benefit. The truly dangerous aspect of this dynamic is how good it feels in the moment. Unlike guilt or fear, which are obviously unpleasant, praise feels like nourishment. It feels like love, like recognition, like finally being seen. And for those who have been starved of genuine appreciation, this false praise can become as addictive as any drug. But notice what happens when you stop performing in the way that earned their praise. The compliments cease immediately. The warm regard turns cold. The person who called you wonderful when you were serving them suddenly finds fault with everything you do. This reveals the truth. Their praise was never about you. It was about what you were doing for them. The sovereign person learns to metabolize praise without becoming dependent on it. They receive compliments graciously, but do not alter their behavior to seek more. They understand that genuine appreciation comes without strings, without expectations, without the subtle pressure to continue earning it. They can distinguish between authentic recognition and manipulative flattery, and they respond accordingly. This independence from praise creates an interesting effect. Those who are used to controlling others through compliments find their primary currency has been devalued. They offer their approval and find it does not purchase what it once did. They withhold their validation and discover it causes no panic, no scramble to regain their favor. Now we arrive at a more subtle form of control, one that operates almost invisibly. There are those who need you to remain small for their own comfort. They will never explicitly tell you to limit yourself, but they will consistently undermine any effort you make to grow. They do this through 1,000 small cuts, each one deniable, each one seemingly innocent. They question your decisions just enough to plant doubt, but not enough to seem unsupportive. They remind you of past failures when you speak of future plans. They express concern about your ambitions, framing their discouragement as care for your well-being. They celebrate your successes with words that somehow make them feel smaller, less significant, less worthy of pride. This is not always conscious manipulation. Sometimes it stems from their own insecurity, their fear that your growth will leave them behind, their worry that your success will highlight their stagnation. But whether conscious or not, the effect is the same. They create an environment where staying small feels safer than growing, where maintaining the status quo seems wiser than risking change. The person who recognizes this dynamic faces a difficult choice. These are often people they care about, people who genuinely believe they are being helpful, people who would be hurt to know the effect of their behavior. But recognition demands response. You cannot unsee what you have seen. You cannot pretend the pattern does not exist once you have identified it. This is where many people get stuck. They see clearly that someone in their life needs them to remain limited, but they feel guilty for seeing it. They tell themselves they are being ungrateful, paranoid, selfish. They second-guess their own perception rather than trust what they observe. And so they remain small, not because they lack the capacity to grow, but because growth would disturb a dynamic that others depend on. The sovereign person makes a different choice. They accept that their growth will threaten some people. They understand that their evolution will be seen as betrayal by those who need them to remain static. They recognize that pursuing their own potential will be interpreted as abandonment by those who have built their comfort on your limitation. And then something predictable happens. The moment you begin to change, the resistance intensifies. This is the punishment phase, and it is as reliable as sunrise. Those who benefited from your previous incarnation will not celebrate your transformation. They will attack it with every tool at their disposal. They will say you have changed, speaking the word like an accusation. They will reminisce about how you used to be, painting your former self as superior to who you are becoming. They will attribute your growth to negative influences, to arrogance, to selfishness. They will try to shame you back into the shape that served them. This punishment serves multiple purposes. It is partly genuine distress at losing the version of you they could control. It is partly an attempt to restore the previous dynamic through emotional pressure, but it is also a test. They want to see if your transformation is real, or if it can be reversed through sufficient disapproval. The person who understands this phase can endure it without yielding. They recognize the attacks as confirmation that their growth is real, that they are successfully breaking free from dynamics that limited them. They understand that the intensity of the resistance often correlates with the significance of the change. The louder the protests, the more necessary the transformation. But enduring this phase requires tremendous strength. Every part of your social conditioning will scream at you to restore harmony, to apologize for changing, to return to the familiar patterns that everyone prefers. You will be tempted to minimize your growth, to hide your evolution, to pretend you are still the person they want you to be. This is where most people fail. They achieve genuine growth, encounter genuine resistance, and then retreat. They apologize for evolving. They water down their boundaries. They return to old patterns with small modifications that do not threaten anyone too much. And in doing so, they teach everyone around them that sufficient pressure will always make them yield. The sovereign person does something different. They accept the discomfort of being misunderstood. They embrace the reality that some relationships will not survive their evolution. They prioritize their own growth over other people's comfort with who they used to be. And then they discover something fascinating about human psychology. People value what is scarce more than what is abundant. The person who is always available, always accommodating, always present becomes invisible through their very reliability. They are taken for granted precisely because they can be counted on absolutely. But the person who makes their presence conditional, who withdraws their energy when it is not valued, who refuses to be infinitely available, creates a different dynamic entirely. Their attention becomes something to be earned rather than assumed. Their time becomes precious because it is not unlimited. Their presence carries weight because it might not always be there. This is not about playing games or being deliberately cruel. It is about recognizing that your energy is finite and choosing to invest it where it is valued. It is about understanding that being endlessly available does not make you loved. It makes you convenient. And convenience is the opposite of value in human psychology. When you begin to practice selective availability, when you stop responding immediately to every request, when you cease being the person who always says yes, something shifts in how others perceive you. They begin to consider whether their request is worth making. They think twice before assuming your participation. They value your presence more because they can no longer take it for granted. The world has constructed an elaborate system that depends on your exhaustion. This is not conspiracy, but observable reality. Look at how society celebrates those who sacrifice their health for productivity, who wear their burnout like a badge of honor, who boast about how little they sleep and how much they endure. This celebration is not innocent. It serves those who benefit from your depletion. An exhausted person cannot think clearly enough to question the systems they serve. They lack the energy to resist, to rebel, to reimagine different ways of being. They operate on autopilot, following prescribed patterns because deviation requires effort they do not have. Their exhaustion becomes the guarantee of their compliance. Consider how many of your daily interactions are designed to drain you. The endless stream of requests that arrive without consideration for your capacity. The crises that somehow always require your immediate attention. The problems that become yours to solve simply because you have solved them before. Each of these interactions takes something from you, and rarely is anything given back to restore what was taken. The system counts on you not noticing this imbalance. It depends on you accepting exhaustion as normal, even noble. It needs you to believe that constant depletion is the price of being good, responsible, valuable. And so you give and give until giving is all you know how to do, until receiving feels foreign, uncomfortable, almost wrong. But exhaustion is not just physical tiredness. It is the complete depletion of your emotional, mental, and spiritual resources. It is waking up already defeated. It is having nothing left for your own dreams because you have spent everything on other people as demands. It is being so empty that you cannot imagine what fullness would even feel like. The sovereign person recognizes exhaustion as a form of control and refuses to participate in their own depletion. They understand that rest is not laziness, but strategy. They know that protecting their energy is not selfishness, but wisdom. They have learned that you cannot pour from an empty cup, and more importantly, that many people will happily let you try. This recognition leads to a disturbing discovery about human nature. Your empathy, the very quality that makes you human, can be turned into a weapon against you. Those who understand this know exactly how to aim it at your heart. They present themselves as victims who need your rescue. They paint their problems as emergencies that require your intervention. They frame their desires as needs that you would be cruel to deny. The empathetic person feels the pain of others as if it were their own. This is a beautiful quality, but in the hands of a manipulator, it becomes a tool of control. They know you cannot watch suffering without wanting to help. They know you will sacrifice your own well-being to ease someone else's discomfort. They know your empathy is a button they can push whenever they need something from you. Watch how this plays out in real relationships. Someone creates a crisis through their own choices, then presents themselves as a victim of circumstances. They could solve their own problem, but they know you will solve it for them if they seem sufficiently distressed. They could take responsibility, but they know you will take it instead if they appear helpless enough. This is not always conscious manipulation. Some people have learned that helplessness gets them help, that crisis gets them attention, that being perpetually overwhelmed gets them rescued. They may not deliberately create these situations, but they have no incentive to change patterns that consistently result in others solving their problems for them. The empathetic person becomes trapped in an endless cycle of rescue. They exhaust themselves trying to save people who are not trying to save themselves. They pour their resources into bottomless pits of need. They become so focused on managing other people's emotions that they lose touch with their own. Breaking this cycle requires a painful recognition. Not everyone who presents themselves as needing help actually needs it. Not every crisis requires your intervention. Not every problem is yours to solve. Some people need to experience the consequences of their choices. Some situations need to unfold without your interference. Some pain needs to be felt by the person who created it. This is where boundaries become essential, but also where they become most violently resisted. The moment you stop rescuing someone who has grown dependent on your rescue, they will paint you as cruel. They will accuse you of abandonment, of heartlessness, of betrayal. They will make you the villain in a story where you were always the hero until you stopped playing your assigned role. The manipulation becomes more sophisticated here. They will not directly demand that you continue sacrificing yourself. Instead, they will frame your boundaries as acts of aggression. Your no becomes an attack on them. Your withdrawal becomes abandonment. Your self-care becomes selfishness. They redefine your self-protection as violence against them. This reframing is powerful because it attacks your self-concept. If you see yourself as a good person, being painted as cruel is deeply uncomfortable. If you pride yourself on being caring, being called heartless strikes at your core identity. The manipulator knows this. They know that attacking who you believe yourself to be is more effective than attacking what you do. The sovereign person learns to withstand these attacks on their character. They understand that those who benefit from your lack of boundaries will always see boundaries as cruelty. They recognize that being called selfish by someone who has been selfishly consuming you is actually confirmation that your boundaries are working. But now we must examine one of the most powerful dynamics in human relationships. Your absence often teaches people lessons your presence never could. When you are always there, always available, always ready to engage, you become background noise in someone else's life. But when you withdraw, when you become suddenly absent, you create a void that demands attention. This void serves multiple purposes. First, it forces people to confront how much space you actually occupied in their life. They discover all the things you were doing that they never noticed, all the support you are providing that they took for granted, all the energy you are investing that they assumed would always be there. Second, your absence removes their ability to manage you through proximity. When you are present, they can read your expressions, gauge your reactions, adjust their behavior to manipulate yours. But when you are absent, they lose these tools. They cannot see the effect of their words. They cannot monitor your emotional state. They cannot correct course based on your responses. Third, and perhaps most importantly, your absence forces them to sit with the consequences of how they treated you. When you are present, they can distract themselves from their behavior with yours. They can focus on what you are doing wrong rather than what they have done. But when you are gone, they are left alone with their own actions, their own choices, their own contribution to your departure. The person who masters strategic absence understands timing. They know when their withdrawal will have maximum impact. They recognize the moment when their presence has become so devalued that only their absence can restore its worth. They understand that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all.